often claims that Africa is poor, and they make no effort to hide this narrative from their citizens. In fact, they constantly reinforce it through their media, portraying the continent as helpless and in need of salvation. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Every year, more money flows out of Africa into the West than the aid the West sends in. That's right. The so-called poor continent is actually financing the wealth of its so-called benefactors. One of the ways they do this? Visa extortion. Yes, we call it extortion because that's exactly what it is. African citizens are forced to pay hefty visa application fees, and when their applications are rejected, no refunds. It's a billion-dollar scheme that exploits the hopes of ordinary Africans seeking opportunities abroad. But now, African leaders are starting to speak up. Among them is the president of Zambia, who has joined the growing chorus of voices demanding change. In a bold statement, he called out the UK and the EU, demanding that visa application fees be refunded when a visa is rejected. It's a simple matter of fairness. The big question now is, will the EU listen?
Abusuafoɔ Kunkonko TV so ni yɛsan so ma mo nyinaa kɔ aba ɛsrɛ wo sɛ bra wo hwɛ wo subscribe wa share wa like ne wa comment ebibre mu mpanimfoɔ nimdeɛ sisi mpanimfoɔ ntotoyɛ ɛne wo hwɛ baabi a wɔkeka kɔ a wotumi sɛ waboa wɔn ho sɛ nko a yɛsomo a watena mu mfinhyia bebree ɛwɔ abrofo nsɛm no ebefiri mu yɛ nneɛma ya dɔdɔdeɛ ne nneɛma pa oduma nkomadeɛ dua ebibre mu ama mu abrofo bɛfa akonya wɔn ho sɛ tam nanso yɛkɔ hɔ yasan koye nkoa ahye yene ayagapade a wo mabefa koye wonkuru eyi enti abusua ehun hyehyeye bi ne ho entotoye a mpanyufo egusu a wo ye no ehun videos ene akeka esi ene asabre ene make Africa adama yenya bia yede esomo ewo afidie so bo modna se wo hwei na utie bi obefa de ye hwei enyina mu aba na nso de aboa wo maya wo na fe nso do adwenkyere ebeto comment section ho na so wahye amofoforo ensa ka de etwagu ewa bibrem ha aha eye Kunkonko TV so bombo na subscribe share like na comment abusue ye mo ani akonhome
Reinforce it through their media, portraying the continent as helpless and in need of salvation. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Every year, more money flows out of Africa into the West than the aid the West sends in. That's right. The so-called poor continent is actually financing the wealth of its so-called benefactors. One of the ways they do this? Visa extortion. Yes, we call it extortion because that's exactly what it is. African citizens are forced to pay hefty visa application fees, and when their applications are rejected, no refunds. It's a billion-dollar scheme that exploits the hopes of ordinary Africans seeking opportunities abroad. But now, African leaders are starting to speak up. Among them is the president of Zambia, who has joined the growing chorus of voices demanding change. In a bold statement, he called out the UK and the EU, demanding that visa application fees be refunded when a visa is rejected. It's a simple matter of fairness. The big question now is, will the EU listen? And if they don't, what should African leaders and citizens do next? Let's find out. The number of Africans migrating to the UK and other European countries has been steadily rising. But here's the thing. Contrary to what many in the West believe, most Africans are actually content to stay on the continent. The dominant narrative in Western media suggests that Africans are desperate to flee, running from poverty, conflict, and chaos. According to that perception, every African is supposedly just waiting for a chance to escape to Europe. But the data tells a very different story. According to the United Nations, the total number of African migrants in 2020 stood at 40.6 million, just 14.6% of the world's total migrant population. Compare that to Asia, which accounted for 41%, and Europe, which represented 22.5%. Let that sink in. Despite being painted as the epicenter of crisis and exodus, Africa contributes a much smaller share to global migration than either Asia or even Europe itself. So, what does this tell you? It tells you that the idea of a continent full of people desperate to escape is not just exaggerated, it's misleading. The majority of Africans want to build their lives at home. They seek dignity, opportunity, and stability, not escape. The real question we should be asking is, why does the West continue to push this narrative? This simply means that the number of migrants from Europe and Asia is significantly higher than those from Africa. In fact, 8% of African migrants remain within the continent. Only about 20% seek to settle in Europe. Of that 20%, just 8% are refugees or enter Europe illegally. The remaining 12% migrate legally, often spending large sums of money to travel by plane in search of better opportunities. Yet, due to widespread bias and the false narrative that African migrants will flood Europe, many European countries have imposed stricter visa restrictions specifically targeting Africans. Did you know that in 2024 alone, the European Union collected over 70 million euros from African applicants whose visa requests were denied? In 2023, that figure stood at approximately 56 million euros. At this rate, projections for 2025 suggest the number will rise even higher. According to the 2023 report, the EU generated 56 million euros from visa application fees paid by Africans whose applications were ultimately rejected, accounting for 43% of all revenues from rejected Schengen visa applications globally. These funds were collected from thousands of African citizens who paid the mandatory non-refundable visa fees, despite the high rejection rates they face. In essence, the EU already has a predetermined number of African applicants it plans to approve each year, yet it continues to charge non-refundable application fees from countless others, knowing many of them will be denied. For many Africans, this isn't just a failed application, it's a devastating loss. Some even go as far as selling their businesses or property just to afford the visa process. Take the case of Joel Anya Egbu. In 2024, Joel applied for a visa to visit Barcelona. He paid the non-refundable fees and submitted all the required documents, but his application was denied. Shocked by the rejection, he applied again, this time submitting even more documentation, including bank statements and proof of property ownership in Nigeria. But Joel was denied again. Just like that, his dream of visiting Barcelona was crushed. Another applicant, a 32-year-old Nigerian gaming consultant, had planned a series of business meetings with partners in Spain. To prepare, he submitted all the required documents and paid the mandatory fees. Yet his visa was also rejected. With no other choice, he had to cancel all his scheduled meetings. He even reached out to the Spanish embassy by email, hoping for an explanation. But to this day, he's received no response. Sadly, these aren't isolated cases. They reflect the lived reality of countless African migrants trying to visit Europe. The common assumption in the EU is that most Africans want to remain in Europe permanently, but that's simply not true. Many Africans apply for visas for legitimate reasons: business trips, vacations, academic programs, or to visit family. Migration has always been a part of human history, but when it comes to Africans, it suddenly becomes controversial, almost like a crime. Meanwhile, the experience for Europeans is the exact opposite. A European passport opens nearly every African border with ease. Most Europeans don't even need to apply for a visa in advance. They get one on arrival, often at little or no cost. No bank statements required, no job verification, no return ticket proof, no long, frustrating process. So, the question remains, why? Why is the African traveler treated as a threat? Why is migration acceptable for some, but a red flag for others? One of the main reasons Africans face so many obstacles when trying to obtain visas to Europe or the United States is simple. These regions don't want them to stay. Nigerian writer Elnathan John captured this harsh reality perfectly in a series of powerful tweets. He wrote, "A good African traveler is one who returns, one who leaves Europe or America quickly. The embassies love them. Good Africans don't move." He added, "It has become like a criminal act for an African to openly admit planning to move to another country. We are made to swear we won't stay. When a European or American wants to move to Africa, they don't apologize. They say it with pride." So why is this the case? Africans traveling on African passports often face an unspoken but very real stereotype, one rooted in suspicion, fear, and centuries-old prejudice. It's as if simply stepping foot into Europe might unleash some kind of uncontrollable migration wave. And so, Africans are subjected to humiliating procedures, endless documents, invasive questions, high fees, and even then, a visa isn't a guarantee. Once at the airport, they still face another wall, immigration officers who look at them with distrust, asking cold, interrogative questions, as if they were criminals trying to infiltrate a fortress. This is the reality many Africans endure just to visit countries that preach freedom, equality, and global citizenship. According to a 2024 report by a London-based research organization, African countries bear the heaviest burden when it comes to visa rejections. The founder of the institute put it bluntly, the poorest countries in the world are paying the richest countries in the world for not getting visas. As of 2023, the trend was undeniable. The poorer the applicant's country, the higher the chance of rejection. African nations are disproportionately affected, with rejection rates soaring as high as 40 to 50% in countries like Ghana, Senegal, and Nigeria. The report highlights this as clear evidence of inbuilt discrimination and bias within the visa application process. In response to this injustice, on Friday, May 23, 2025, Zambian President Hakainde Hichilema made a bold demand. He called on the European Union to refund visa application fees for Zambian citizens whose applications are rejected. His announcement shines a spotlight on the financial burden placed on ordinary Zambians, many of whom save for months to afford these non-refundable fees, often applying for purposes as legitimate as tourism, education, or business, only to be turned away. President Hakainde Hichilema argued that charging fees for unsuccessful visa applications is fundamentally unfair. Applicants, he said, are forced to pay for an administrative process that often ends in rejection, without clear explanations or accountability. Our people should not lose hard-earned money when their visa requests are turned down, often without transparent reasons, he told Block TV. He proposed a fairer approach, charge fees only for successful applications. Hichilema urged the EU and UK to adopt a refund system for rejected applicants. It's a powerful and reasonable demand. But let's be honest, the EU and UK are unlikely to ever adopt such a system. Why? Because the current model is a quiet, consistent source of revenue. According to the EU, these non-refundable fees are used to cover administrative costs and help maintain the integrity of the Schengen zone. But for many Africans, it feels more like a legal form of extortion. This harsh reality was subtly confirmed by none other than the U.S. ambassador to Kenya, Meg Whitman. In a 2024 interview, a Kenyan journalist asked why it's so easy for Americans to visit Kenya, but so difficult for Kenyans to enter the U.S., even when applying for spousal visas. The ambassador's response was diplomatic, but telling. Between the lines, it was clear. For many Western governments, the visa system isn't just about security or logistics, it's about control and, quite frankly, profit. According to U.S. Ambassador Meg Whitman, the visa department is primarily funded by visa fees. In her own words, they need those fees to keep the department running. In other words, they already know how many applicants they'll approve each year, but they still collect fees from everyone because it's a revenue stream. To them, it's just business. But for many Africans who sell land, drain savings, or even give up their livelihoods just to afford a visa application, it's not business, it's extortion, it's exploitation, and frankly, it should be called a human rights abuse. Critics have gone further to expose a darker irony. Some suggest that the aid Europe provides to Africa may actually be offset by the revenue it generates from rejected visa applications. Think about that. The money Africans spend chasing the dream of travel, only to be rejected, is recycled back into Africa as development aid, often tied to strict conditions and Western interests. In simple terms, Africans are funding their own dependency. As one international relations analyst put it, this is one of the most profitable intercontinental business models in modern times. A system where Africans are systematically denied access, while the money they pay into that system comes back as conditional support, wrapped in the language of generosity. And when you really think about it, it's just another way Africa continues to be a net supplier to the West, not just in gold, oil, and cobalt, but in raw cash. This is why analysts and African leaders, like Zambian President Hakainde Hichilema, are demanding a change. They're calling for greater transparency in visa processing and a serious review of fee structures, especially for countries with consistently high rejection rates. But beyond just calling for change, Africans need to begin taking deliberate and responsive actions. Take the case of Jean Mamboul, a Cameroonian-born man who was raised in France. In 2022, Jean applied for a visa for himself and his wife using nearly identical documentation. Shockingly, his wife, who was unemployed at the time and held only a South African passport, was granted a visa based on Jean's financial records. He, on the other hand, was denied. Why? The embassy claimed Jean's documents were fake and said they weren't convinced he would return to South Africa, even though he was a permanent resident.